Let us now put the highlight on sampling risk. Now, while we know that sampling risk is the risk that you were able to get a sample that is not representative of the population, we must now understand that there are actually two types of sampling risk. There is what we call the type 1 or the alpha risk and the type 2 or the beta risk. Now, the alpha risk is said to affect efficiency. And of course, when we talk about efficiency, we refer to the resources and the time it takes us to complete an audit. On the other hand, the type 2, or what we call a beta risk, affects effectiveness. This means to say, in the context of the audit, the effectiveness of the audit lies in the opinion that is given by the auditor. And so, therefore, when something influences the possibility of you giving an inappropriate opinion, that is type 2 or beta risk. Now, both type 1 and type 2 risks will exist in either test of controls or substantive tests. So, let's have test of controls first. For test of controls, we call this one the risk of under reliance or the risk of assessing control risk too high. We remember that if we assess control risk as high, that means we did not rely on the controls. All right, so therefore, this is the risk of assessing control risk too high. That means you did not rely on the controls. On the other hand, type 2 risk for test of controls is called the risk of over reliance or the risk of assessing control risk too low. Again, because if we assess control risk as low, that means we relied on the controls. Now, in order for us to really appreciate what is meant by this under reliance, over reliance, let's try to open these four quadrants. So, if you've ever read an auditing theory text, then you might find this is a very common way for authors and lecturers to illustrate type 1 and type 2 risks. Now, please pay attention to those items in yellow outline, for the shapes in yellow outline that will represent the population, but those shapes in red outline will represent the sample. Again, remember that we are not testing the entire population, we just got a sample of the population. Now, if in case your test of controls would have revealed that the population is reliable, meaning to say, had you tested the entire population, you would have known that it was reliable. And when you took the sample, it so happened that the sample also showed that the population is reliable. And so in this case, we have no problem because bravo, we were able to get a representative sample. How do you know that the sample is representative? Well, just take a look at that. The sample looks like the population, right? The sample says reliable, the population would have shown you that it is reliable. In certain instances as well, it's possible that it's possible that the controls are unreliable. Like, had you tested the entire population, you would have seen that the controls are unreliable. Now you are performing sampling, and the results of your sample show that the controls are unreliable. So again, you were able to get a representative sample. So, bravo you. That means that your conclusion will be correct. Remember what we said in the previous video? Our decision will be based on the sample because it is what we have seen, it's what we have actually tested. And so, therefore, in the case of our first two illustrations, the auditor will be able to give a correct decision because in this case, the sample looks like the population. There are instances, however, when such is not the case, such as you may be able to encounter a population that is supposed to be reliable, meaning, had you tested the entire population, you would have shown that the controls were reliable, but because you only took a sample and the sample showed you that the population is not reliable. So the sample does not look like the population. And remember, we make our decision based on the sample. So in this case, our decision would be to say that controls are not reliable, when in truth, they are reliable. So what did we do? We did not rely on the reliable. And this is what we call under reliance, because you could have relied on it. Had you only known the truth, had you only tested the entire population, you would have seen that the controls are reliable. But because you only took a sample, and unfortunately the sample is not representative of the population, you made a decision not to rely on the controls. You did not rely on the reliable. This is the risk of under reliance. Now, if we take this further and if we imagine, all right, at first I thought the controls were reliable, so I tested the controls. But when I tested the controls, the results of my sample showed that it was not reliable, when in truth it was. So if it was not reliable, then the auditor would say, all right, meaning to say the controls are not reliable, I will have to extend my substantive testing. I will have to intensify my substantive testing. I will have to increase my substantive testing. And so, therefore, what happens then? The auditor utilizes more resources, the auditor utilizes more time to finish the audit, and so, therefore, it has affected the efficiency of the auditor. Had he only known, then he wouldn't have needed to intensify his testing, right? On the other hand, it's also possible that, well, the true state of the population is that the controls are not reliable. But because you only took a sample and the sample showed you that the controls are reliable, so therefore your decision will be to rely on the unreliable. So this is now the risk of over reliance. So imagine what will happen now when you relied on the unreliable. It's like, have you ever been in a situation where you had your trust broken or your heart broken, for example, because you thought the person is reliable but ended up breaking your heart? So that is over reliance. You relied on the controls, which are not reliable. And so, what happens when the auditor relied on the controls, which were actually not good, controls which are actually weak, but you decided to rely on it? The auditor will now decrease substantive testing. And the less substantive testing that the auditor performs, the bigger is the chance that the auditor will not be able to detect the misstatements. So this then affects effectiveness. Why do we say it affects effectiveness? Because eventually it will affect the decision in the form of the opinion that you will be giving. And so therefore the auditor might give an opinion that the financial statements are fairly stated when in fact they are not, only because the auditor did not test more because the auditor thought that the controls are reliable, when in fact they are not. So this is your type 1 and your type 2 risk. Okay, in the case of test of controls. Now, we also apply the same concepts, but this time in the case of substantive testing. So, again, it still affects efficiency and effectiveness for alpha and beta, but this time, if we talk about alpha risk or the type 1 risk, we now refer to it as the risk of incorrect rejection, meaning to say you have rejected what is correct. Okay. In the same manner that substantive testing beta risk will now be referred to as the risk of incorrect acceptance. You have accepted that which is incorrect. So we open up again the four quadrants like we did a while back, only this time we now talk about misstatements. So it's possible that the population is not materially misstated. You performed sampling and you saw, based on the results of the sample, that it's not materially misstated. So bravo us. We have chance upon a representative sample. It's also possible that the financial statements are materially misstated and our sample showed that it's materially misstated. Of course, we're sad that it's materially misstated, but also happy because of the fact that we were able to get a representative sample. However, it's possible that the financial statements are not materially misstated. And what happened is that your sample said it is materially misstated. And so what you did is you decided to expand your testing. You decided perhaps to ask management to adjust because you thought it was materially misstated. So you have consumed more resources and time in order to finish the audit. On the other hand, it's possible that the population is materially misstated, but you thought it was okay. You thought it was okay because a sample said so. And so you decided to accept it, okay, as true when in fact it was false. And accepting it as true would mean you will be giving, accepting it as not materially misstated means you will be giving an unqualified opinion on financial statements which are actually materially misstated. And that is what affects the effectiveness of your audit. That is what's going to expose you to a lot of, well, give you a lot of legal exposure and liability because you gave an incorrect opinion. So, again, the risk of incorrect rejection, That would have been the correct one, but you decided to reject, you decided to say no, and so therefore you still kept on testing, you still kept on looking, and the other one is the risk of incorrect acceptance. That's still not yet the one. The FS is materially misstated, and yet you decided to embrace it with open arms and you ended up getting hurt. So that is the risk of incorrect acceptance. So type 1 and type 2 risks. Needless to say, the auditor is more concerned about type 2 risk. Type 2 risk is scarier for the auditor because this is the one which gives rise to the possibility of you giving an incorrect opinion. And so, with that, the auditor will strive to manage, will strive to control type 2 risk. All right. So, those are the two types of sampling risks. Now let's take a look at what are the general approaches to audit sampling. So we essentially have two. We have what is called a non-statistical sampling and a statistical sampling plan. So if you're using a non-statistical sampling, this purely uses auditor's judgment in estimating the sampling risk, determining the sample size, and evaluating the sample results. In other words, there is no need for you to make use of sophisticated statistical formulae to come up with your sample size or your risks. Okay, so in the case of non statistical sampling plans, the auditor does not quantify the sampling risk. However, in terms of statistical sampling uses random based selection of the sample and the law of probability to measure sampling risk and evaluate sample results. I'd like for you to remember or go back to the time when you perhaps performed or had a research subject. Okay, one of your classes must have been a research class, and you might have dabbled a bit into quantitative research and you were made to compute a sample size. So if you computed a sample size based on certain parameters such as your confidence interval, your confidence level, or the acceptable risk level, then you have most likely been performing statistical sampling. However, in the case of non-statistical sampling, it's purely auditor's judgment. Auditor says test 20 invoices, test 50 invoices. Unlike statistical sampling, wherein there has to be a measurement or a quantification of the risk. The good news is both sampling plans are acceptable. Okay, so whether you go for non-stat or stat, they are both acceptable. So if you're a little bit averse to statistics, this is definitely good news for you. And both non-stat and statistical sampling still use auditor judgment. That means to say, even if you go by statistical sampling, it will never totally eliminate the need for auditor judgment. It's just that in the case of non-statistical, well, it's entirely auditor's judgment. All right. Now, another thing as well that we must remember is that in the case of non-statistical sampling may use either probabilistic or non-probabilistic selection. That means the auditor has a freer rein as to the sample selection techniques that the auditor will use later on. But if the auditor uses statistical sampling, the auditor may only use probabilistic selection. Having said that, we then get to see that statistical sampling carries on a more selective or more strict approach to sampling. But regardless, both are acceptable. Now, what are probabilistic and non probabilistic selection methods? We'll talk more about that in the next few slides. All right. So, for now, let's visit what are the two types of audit sampling plans. Well, we do have what is called attribute sampling and variable sampling. So, when you talk about attribute sampling, attribute, that's the characteristic, right? So attribute sampling is used to estimate the frequency or occurrence of a certain characteristic. So we call this one the occurrence rate. And this is generally used for tests of controls to estimate the rate of deviation. So if, for example, the characteristic that you are expecting to be present is that, for example, of the presence of signatories for authorization, or pre-numbering, for example, of the documents, or signs of review and approval, that's the characteristic. So every time you don't see that characteristic, then it's a deviation. If you see, for example, a customer order or a sales order with no clear approval, that's a deviation. Okay, so with that, we are performing tests of controls, and the sampling plan that we are using is attribute sampling. The other one is called variable sampling. Variable sampling is used to estimate the numerical measurement of a population, such as a peso or a dollar value. I think with that, you could already picture out that variable sampling is generally used in substantive tests. All right, so we have just talked about sampling risk and the two types of sampling risk. We have talked about the general approaches to sampling and now the audit sampling plans. We are ready to talk about the steps in audit planning. But again, since this might be a bit too lengthy if we're going to cram it up in one video, we're going to stop here and I'm going to hope to see you in the next video.